All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Mickey Tong. I run this space, Idolwild. And I just wanted to thank you for coming to this talk today, featuring two of the artists for Maternal Waters, Beth Davila Waldman and Katie Murken. I also wanted you to welcome our moderator today, Daniel Gerwin, who is also an artist, curator, and he writes for publications like Brooklyn Rail, Art Forum, Hyperallergic. Please give them a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Mickey, for the kind introduction, for hosting us, and thanks all you guys for coming out today, making it lively despite this the first beautiful day we've had in LA forever. I was like, oh, no one's going to want to come today. But thank you guys for being die-hard art fans and showing up. I appreciate it. And in terms of how we do this, you know, I have a bunch of questions of things that I was interested in talking to Beth and Katie about with the show, but I want to invite you all to just like jump in. It's a small group, so I think that we don't have to wait till the end for Q&A. If you have a question, just jump in. If something, you know, we're talking about something that sparks something for you, that'll, I think, make it richer. So don't be shy, folks. All right. So I just want to ask, you know, by way of general introduction, to hear, I was like sort of hearing the backstory of how you guys met, you know, how this show came to exist in your minds and evolved. You know, was it as specific as this when you first conceptualized it, or was it broader and kind of found it? So I'm interested in some of that backstory.
Do you want to share how we first met?
I'll share how we met, and Beth can talk about the show. Yeah, so I moved to the Bay Area in 2018, not knowing very many people, let alone artists. One of the first artists that I did meet was Mushi Wusong James, who's a fabulous artist, but also does documentary videos about artists. And so we became friends, and you know, I was talking about my interest in exhibiting in LA and getting to know the galleries more, and he was like, well, you have to get to know Beth Waldman. Like, she's so active down there, and her work is great. So he introduced us, and I think our first meeting was a studio visit at my home studio in Alameda. So Beth came, and you've probably seen...
Was that 2020?
Yeah, or 2021 maybe.
Okay, yeah.
But we had a great talk and really connected kind of over the materiality in our work, and especially the way that we both use images kind of as a starting point and then deconstruct those in different ways. Mm-hmm. And also talked about motherhood and just the challenges of that, and also like how that affected our practice and influenced our imagery. Mm-hmm. So yeah, then the show.
Yeah, and I think you were doing a residency at CLA at the time, CLA Art Institute, and I had done one years before. I was the parent, I got the Parent Art Residency Award. You know, I appreciated to have that. Yeah, right. So, yeah, no, it was great. I think, you know, between that first studio visit and the film that Mushi made was really compelling. We put it around on social media, and it really was great to dive even deeper, because I think that you were starting to work on a number of the works that I see here. We were discussing landscape a lot, and I think I was drawn to like a lot of the works where she was bringing in landscape. So there was the materiality, but I felt like there was a conversation that was starting that, you know, I also had been toiling with the word landscape a lot in my work, and had started making connections there beyond the linear connection to landscape, and really appreciated where she was going with it, and this sort of extraction that was going on in her work, just in a process base as well as the ideas that were there. And I started developing an idea for this show later, so sometime, gosh, when was it? Mickey and I started talking, I think it was, I don't know, was it 6 months ago, 9 months ago? I can't keep track of time, but yeah, I think Katie and I reconnected, and just, I was thinking about her work then and the work of other artists too. So we had really wanted, I like the idea of taking a topic and having it speak to ideas on many levels versus it being so didactic. So I felt like our work had similarities but enough conceptual differences that it would work well together. I mean, the idea of the show, which happened to be lined up to be in May, I was like, it was cool, like Mother's Day, but you know, it was really the navigation of this sort of journey. One can call it water because it relates, but we both have our individual entry points to that, and you know, maternal water is embracing material memory and politics. I felt like we're true to the direction both of our works were taking. And then also I knew the work that I was wanting to show of my own for the show, so that affected the direction, but also the title and the concept had to be, you know, open enough for the other artist's work I was considering. So it developed nicely, and I really like the very unique ways that we're approaching that overall concept, you know, in one show.
This piece is called Maternal Waters.
Yes.
And, you know, this one, of course, you know, we have a grid of 9 images of this sort of turbulent, you know, foaming white water. And, you know, it's an interesting one to me because, you know, when I think of the linguistically maternal waters, of course, I think of like amniotic fluid and, you know, that kind of environment, which is very different from what's here, but kind of not that far. It's still aqueous and liquid and, you know, a generative space. But the other thing I was thinking about, you know, when you talk about, you know, memory in your sort of subtitle, you know, this is not still water, this is surging, churning water. And so I think of it as, these are still photographs of something that's never actually still. And so there's a little bit of a disjuncture or a remove from what memory can achieve or what it can bring back that I was interested in. And so I'm wondering, like, a little bit about your thought between the contrast from an image like this, which is very turbulent and showing something, and you also have, I gotta say, the gold on the edge kind of, it brings in the sacred, if we think about, you know, the tradition of the sort of Byzantine, you know, gold-backed imagery. So, you know, we think about that, and then, you know, this piece, which also has gold in it, but it's a completely still photograph, completely calm, nothing moving. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship between these two kinds of images in the show.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. These both were shot the same day in 2015 in Mollendo, and at the time, you know, I knew that Mollendo was the first time I'd been there. This is in southern Peru, in the state of Arequipa, but Arequipa, the city, is what I've known the most throughout my life until 2015 when we drove outside the city of Arequipa. So my mother was born and raised in Arequipa, so when I was 4 months old and, you know, 2 years old, and, you know, every handful of years, you know, as a kid, I went to Arequipa and I had this closeness with my family and these memories there, but this was kind of driving all the way to the coast, which is about 2 hours from the city of Arequipa. There's a lot of landscape that I didn't know, and it really introduced me to a lot of elements from Arequipa and the expansive economy, the copper and gold mining that was going on out there, and what was going on, like, you know, what were all these little small little areas that were being developed, like where are these buses going, you know, what's the deal with all these gas stations, and all the way out to the coast. And Mollendo initially was the first main coast in southern Peru before secondary coast opened up. And it also had like a new area and an old area. So in 2016, I usually use architecture in my work. And so this is pretty unique, as in it's not so architecturally based, but I've been dealing with other still images in my own photographs of the old part of Mollendo. I created a whole series in 2016. And so there was a lot of time spent there, like thinking about, and that area seemed to be like a place that had elements of life, like hanging clothes or some flowers or plants, but the homes looked deserted, like the architecture spoke of ruins. And so looking back, this was more of a landscape, piece of place, but I also that day went to this area and photographed the waves crashing against the coast, and knew something would come of it, but I didn't know what would come. But it was just kind of a really powerful moment. I don't know, it just kind of moved me. And it was years later that in 2020 I had Linda Albuquerque came and visited my studio while I was at 18th Street Art Center, and she asked me more and more questions about my history. And at a certain point I felt like I didn't know, like my mother's father's was supposedly from Chile, but where were his parents from? And it became a stopping point. And then I asked my mother a lot of questions, and she's like, well, we didn't ask this back in this day. And it kind of went in this direction of discovering my grandfather was born in Mollendo, and his mother came in as an immigrant through Mollendo. And this is it's an unknown sort of part of my ancestry, and it's also like a hidden Jew part of my ancestry. Like my mother grew up Catholic, no one knew her father was Jewish until his deathbed. And so and I was raised Jewish, my father's Jewish, and it was just a thing where all of a sudden, like, I felt like I knew my roots, and then I felt like I didn't, and somehow it drew me back to a purpose of using these photographs. So there was some distance in time. There were different experiences and undefined experiences, but pulling these out, and this happens is sometimes over time. I'm working with imagery from 5 or 8 years ago, and I don't always know what I'm going to do with the work until it hits me. And all of a sudden, all of those pieces coming together was kind of frustrating, because I like knowing my family history, and I felt like, okay, how am I supposed to know? There aren't any answers. So I think that is part of a dual relationship to that place.
Yeah, well, I mean, listening to you describe that, again, it strikes me how water is something that covers things, and things are submerged underneath, and there's a sort of attempt on your part to get below that and recapture history. Below, what's below the surface that you knew growing up, and there's something completely different.
Right.
Which is great. And you're someone who cuts the surface of your material in order to reveal something different. And what's striking to me, because I have known your work for a long time. Katie and I have known each other a long time from Philadelphia back in the day, and these. These works on the back wall are older works. Not that old, but they're older than these. These 4 are newer, from 2022, and these are preceding. And this is the vein that I knew Katie's work in previously, where you're cutting in this sort of very grid-like way to create a relationship between these consumable products for feeding your family, kind of basic day-to-day products. Against the backgrounds of the fields where agricultural production takes place and so forth. And so you're putting those things into direct dialogue, whereas these are much more abstract by comparison. There's still a grid involved here, but in these two, it really starts to literally disintegrate, that grid, the relationship to the grid, even though it's visible. But the ground now, except for the stakes over there, the ground is now washes, like it's abstract. So I'm interested in hearing you talk about how you came from there to here, and then how that has shifted the subject matter for you, if it has.
Yeah. I think I'll start by talking about my process a little bit, because it helps you to understand how I would go from something so geometric to something more abstract. But each of my projects tends to take about 5 years to create, and so I'm a very slow worker, and I'm very into process and going deep into process and letting that kind of guide the outcome. And so what I do is I kind of wait for a certain material to speak to me, like kind of how Beth talked about being really impacted by that experience of standing by this water. I work with found materials, and so I kind of wait until I have like a resonance with the material, and I'm looking for things that are kind of like consumer byproducts, like, you know, waste from consumerism that ends up landing in the domestic space. And I'm really interested in those things that kind of accumulate as waste in the domestic space and become kind of the burden of whoever's responsible for that space. And, you know, traditionally that's the housewife. And that was kind of the role that my mother played. She was very concerned about the environment. She stayed at home, and I think she felt really burdened by all of this waste and felt it was her responsibility to kind of be an environmental steward, teach her children how to take care of the environment. So I have this background, and I started looking for materials that kind of remind me of that history of you know, what mothers have been through in capitalism. So just for example, things I've worked with are like telephone books was one of my early found material projects. And then I moved on to being really interested in plastic bags and using those to create stained glass. You know, and as I'm nearing the end of a project, I'm like, oh man, what's the next thing gonna be? I've been working on this for 5 years. Like, come on. So after my kids were born, I was very much stuck at home. I had left a teaching job. I wanted to kind of like spend the time with my kids, but you know, it was a big decision. So I was very much in the domestic space and started just noticing the grocery ads coming into the house and how every week they come in and every week they go into the recycle bin, and it's just this like constant circularity kind of the material. So I was intrigued by its ephemerality. I love paper, I always work with paper. But also it had these like strong memories for me tied into my mom's coupon clipping, and also like, you know, I talked about her wanting to kind of keep everything. So I chose this material and I had no idea where it would lead me. That's usually the case. I just feel something and then dive in and see where it goes. So I almost always start by like cutting my X-Acto knife, that's my thing. So there is a body of work that precedes this, and then there's kind of something in between that's not really showable. And then I view this as kind of like what I was going for the whole time. Like, these are maybe more of a stepping stone to what I see as like the more authentic expression of this idea. So for the pieces on the back wall, it was more about deconstructing the forms that I saw in the grocery ads, kind of pulling those out and seeing what was left behind, which ended up being these very dominant grids that also had an architectural feel. And I played around with that, but then I started to feel that it needed to connect to something outside of itself. Normally I just work in this self-contained environment of the material, but this time it was telling me to like look outwards. And being a newcomer to California, I was really struck by the industrial farming and like what it did to the landscape, and I could just feel how unnatural it was and kind of how violent it was. And it felt like it made a lot of sense to bring those images together. And at first I feel like they came together in this very geometric kind of way where I was almost weaving the two together, you know, thinking about warp and weft and how to like merge the two in that way. But I think it still wasn't personal enough. And I think that's what led to these, it was like, well, what am I really trying to say? Am I talking about consumption and agriculture, or am I talking more about my experience as a mother? And so I think the biggest shift that happened was that I decided it involved water, which I love because it kind of ties into this show. But I started translating the farm imagery through painting instead of just using that imagery as direct photography and collage. I started painting it, and it created this very feminine version of the form that to me had like a completely different meaning. It started to talk about the land, the earth, as a feminine entity, or as Mother Earth. And that connected back to the female body and the actual physical experience of mothering. And so those watery lines that you see are all derived from the farmland, but then it took on its own, it became a symbol to me of feminine power and regeneration. And that kind of defined how I was going to use the other forms. And I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, that's nice because, you know, I hadn't seen the rose until, and then you say it, and now of course I can't unsee it, but what's nice about it is that while I can now understand, okay, we've got a horizon line of, a field, we've got the rows that are, just plowed out by the tractors, and that's where this comes from, it still retains its abstraction and it becomes a much more open image than these, which are, comparatively locked down. And so it is actually makes an enormous difference. And but I hadn't seen that source, and now I can see it all. And that's really lovely to know. That's great. Let's talk for a minute about photography a little bit more. We've talked about the relationship of water and how that is a connector for the two of you, but photography is also a big connection between the works that you have up here. Photography, of course, freezes an image in time, which this shows. Although what I like about your grid is it kind of also unfreezes it. We have each individual photo as a frozen moment, but by showing us 9 of them together, we still get a sense of that mutability that's native to this particular image. But a photograph, ultimately, an individual photograph is a frozen moment, whereas a painting process, or even your cutting process, is a temporal process. We're looking at the residue of something that happened over time, not in a moment. So there is a difference in that way. But I'm curious to hear the two of you talk about what photography means for each of you in your studio and how you work and how it connects to the things that you think about. If you want to start with that, and also feel free to talk about each other's work too, like what you see in each other's use of photography. Because I think you both use it heavily, so I'm interested. And this, for all of you to know, I should just mention, the imagery on the sail is actually one of these images as well. You can sort of make out the black areas of rock versus the grayish blue of the water. And so this also starts with a photograph, the image on the sail.
Yeah, and actually there are about 5 different photographs that were transferred to the sail to create the work, but they all are one of these. So, these were really at the heart of leading the project, and with a lot of my work in general, I start with a photograph, and it usually goes through transformation from a more traditional photograph really into more of an object-based relationship, and I've been using the photo transfer process quite a bit, but also using a UV flatbed printer at times to print on tarp, which is what you see here. But I'm wanting to translate the photograph, my own source photographs, into a realm where it's merging and becoming akin to a material and an object. So with these, I think about the role of like image and paint quite a bit, and photography and image. Like I speak a lot about image and photography and my own art. To date, I'm only using my own images, but I very much think about how we're in a world where we're exposed to a lot of images, and there's a lot of repetition. And I think my background isn't in photography, it's in sculpture. So I feel a lot of freedom. I really ended up having much more of a conceptual entry point to art. It's my second degree at SFAI, and that leads to many possibilities. But I really like in this show how there's the use of these main images. There are 10 in the series, but this is a 9 that constructed this grid and this piece that are then, through the means we have available, I can scale it up to 40 by 60 inch prints on the film acetate and transfer them at a different scale, and then have some of these same images used to create this texture and idea of the ocean right on the sail, and that this image I haven't used before in any work, but there's still this idea of this interchangeable relationship. That this is almost like the the starting point, and I have many more in the series to create. I've printed each of these at 40 by 60, and some of them have been used and some haven't, and I have more sale material, and I have primed canvases, so who knows what the next direction will be, but this idea more in, I guess, like a postmodern photography sort of world where, there are steps away from the image being only what it is itself, as like this is one captured image. I'm loving photography and using photography, but I'm almost fighting the fight of the assumed role of photography when it was deemed as this is reality, this is one image in time, this is now better than a historical painting of an image in time. This is so I'm very much trying to use more some more subjective and maybe more interpretive ways from the audience to look at my photographs that have been processed or put through process to have them evolve in more of a manner that one might more traditionally relate to sculpture or painting than just photography. So, I think even, back to like Salvador Dali had a piece called like the double image from 1965 where he was playing off this idea, well, not an image of like, what do you do when you have two images that are side by side, or the development of two images side by side, and later, Vito Conchi played around with like this piece called After Motherwell that was basically creating a repetition and interestingly a grid of Motherwell's paintings, and like how do we interpret this? So this idea of how like repetition can come and be used, we start in a photographic sort of foundation and you can push or question that, automatic maybe relationship to photography into different areas. So, I think that I do depend on certain formal qualities in that regard.
Mm-hmm. On a formal level, it also occurs to me, you're taking a picture and then your most sort of major intervention is how you then, what material you join that to, whether it's a sail or a cardboard or, the corrugated material that I associate with favelas or construction and things like that. And you start with but it's your photographs, but then that's your big intervention is how you join them to a sculptural kind of existence. And you're taking found photographs, they're not, but you make them yours through your sort of invasion of them and disruption of them and so on. So I'd be interested in hearing you sort of talk about that relationship to photography for you.
It's a little different. I do actually take all the pictures.
So are these photographs of flyers, not the flyers themselves?
I know, it gets really confusing.
Yeah, well, but that's interesting to hear because I assumed that you were actually working with like the newsprint, but actually maybe it's a print or a transfer.
Well, you're seeing a little bit of everything, and it has to do with that process I was talking about that at the beginning I was. So the two that are flanking, the one with the red rectangle, those are the newsprint material layered on top of a photograph. These don't have any of the ads in them. It's all been, I've generated all the imagery.
Are you scanning it or photographing it?
Yeah,
How are you doing
let me talk about it. So
sly.
Yeah, I know. So I actually do use photography in a documentary way as well. And I use it to capture the world around me and to, from that, create kind of a found material. Because I don't really draw a lot. And I find photography to be such an amazing way to just capture imagery, to find inspiration, just to like document my thought process. So I try to be really, I'm also like, wasn't trained in photography. I feel like I'm not very good at it. So I try to just be spontaneous with it and do what I can do with the skills that I have. And then the artistry, I think, comes in my manipulation and how I layer that with other images. But the farm photographs on this wall, it was kind of special because at first I knew I wanted to use farm imagery and started just like Googling some images and printing them out. And then I was like, no, I think this needs to be a whole investigation of the landscape here in California. So I went down to the San Joaquin Valley that you were talking about as like architectural.
Yeah.
They're actually just enlargements of the same forms.
But it is noteworthy that in this work, you're taking way more liberties with the source material than you did there, you know, and so on some level, the scale, a lot of things were predetermined and kind of out of your hands, and here you've sort of taken control of all the parameters, and that's giving you all this freedom to make things that are much, much different, which is really...
Yeah, and I'm not feeling done with it. Like, so we have the alcohol case and the meat case, but I have great images of like I want to call it soda pop for some reason because I'm from Pennsylvania, but the Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Some of them I feel like aren't working, and I do have to be selective, but there's still a lot of material.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, let's pursue these images for just another moment because there is a predominance of alcohol in these new, you know, these 4 new works, which is not visible there, and it's not, you know, we had a little email conversation, it's not food in the same way, you know, people buy alcohol for different sets of reasons than they buy the kind of products that you've got going on this wall. So I'm wondering, you know, why do you think alcohol has sort of caught your attention and been useful to you now, or
That's
important?
a really good question. I think when I started taking the photographs in the store and then coming back to the studio and printing them and looking at them, I started to notice that, like I was saying, each of these departments kind of like relates to a certain kind of desire. You know, I really grappled with the meat pictures because there's like a really strong implied feeling of violence to them. And I was like, is this territory I really want to go into? But I really did. I wanted to talk about the violence of like towards caregivers and parents in this culture. And so I felt like I should go for it. The alcohol, it was kind of the same. It was like, you know, you're confronting these different, the way that, you know, in consumerism, they kind of play on basic human needs of like sustenance and comfort and security and things like that. And with alcohol, I think in a way it's preying on like feelings of emptiness, especially, you know, what we might feel in, like as new parents, being really isolated. Yeah, and it felt also like there was a darkness to it. It was like the cold case, and it was like framed in black and heavy, and I think it touched on this like melancholy that I really wanted to incorporate into the work. And as I was getting out, I actually was playing around with the Coca-Cola images over this week. I was like, oh, sugar's a totally different thing. It's like, I don't know, that's when you think about like kids getting like addicted and it's really like heavy duty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was also thinking, I mean, like I'm attracted to a lot of these landscapes, you know, from your drives because of the lack of water, right? And one might deem, you know, mothers to be like the ones who determine, you know, still today, it's often what mothers spend more money on things in the household, including groceries, and, you know, are making these consumer choices for their family. And, you know, when I see lack of water and beef, I mean, that, you know, right there is political for me, and speaks really to the choices that we're making, you know, with our pocketbooks, you know, and how we eat, and also, you know, how we might read, you know, choices for our health. And no judgment, I'm a meat eater, but like, you know, it's just thinking about whether it's alcohol, sodas, or meat, or, you know, how we're draining or overworking, extracting all the nutrients from our land. You know, you do this drive, I know we've done the 5 a lot, you know, I do the 5 all the time, San Francisco to LA, it's just, it is like heartbreaking, right? It seems like things are being sucked out, yet there's a plentifulness of whatever we want, and it seems like in this like American sort of grocery store, you're touching upon like the various different touch points, which, you know, grab and go, and it can be like almost all this stuff is, there are items that can be found at Walmart. So, you know, if you only have so many stores, like especially these big gaps between cities, what is being fed is like kind of this national consumerism, like the alcohol, meat, supersize it, like that whole conversation. And so that against the barren landscapes where, California produces all this great, food, but at what cost, right? So for me, that's how a lot of these works fit into like the political, right? And when I see the choices, to me, they're more of a variety of the things that Americans all have easy access to. I mean, you can really probably get any of these at, Kmart, anywhere. So, and then it becomes the question of it adds another layer of, how we eat and how we see landscape of, like America the Beautiful, but like, hey, guess what? What are we doing to our earth? So to me, it conjures a lot of these ideas, especially because of the lack of water that we in California, when you came here, right? It was like the fires, all of that, and so that's heavy. It's the lack of water, too. Yeah.
But your work also combines and addresses the deeply personal and the more broadly political. And so I was curious, with this piece behind us, which is this is Exodus, this is Maternal Waters, this is extended shelters. Extended shelters. I'm interested in your choice to use the corrugated metal because to me, especially when you think about Central and South America, it's like there's a call out to economic inequality, and the harshness of that. And I'm wondering if that was something you were looking for or that got smuggled along with other concerns that you had, or how did you arrive at the corrugated metal as a sculptural base for this image? And what are your thoughts about the role it's playing here?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, I mean, right outside our door, there's lots of lovely corrugated metal, and been to Brazil, I've seen some favelas, but what I started noticing with a lot of travels, including this time period in Peru, was the use of, so this is when my tarp works kicked off. 2016 was after my 2015 trip to Peru. At that time already in the Bay Area, tons of tent cities, looking at the fact that there was no homelessness in Arequipa, and I'm like, what, where are the homeless people? Like there's no, and then I would drive outside the city and there are these really squatting areas. I mean, one piece in my work's Hala Ocupacion, which literally has a whole valley, many of you have seen it, of squatters, like people creating like, okay, we can't afford to live in the city, we're just gonna build communities outside. And so what they use anything that they can find, from used political signs, tarp, corrugated metal as their construction materials for shelter. So that's been like a big theme, and I've been sticking to tarp quite a bit. I had a aha moment like in 2021, probably a 3 a.m. sort of idea, but I was like, what other, so that was like the edge point of like, is there another material that could speak to this idea of shelter? And that's a globally accessible material that we see, in LA, not just in the tent cities, or some people use corrugated metal as, my father's an architect, so, some people, use corrugated metal. I've seen it in LA to create really cool sort of modern fences. And then, so it was less about like, it was more, I try to use materials that are more globally accessible. And when I've gone to Hong Kong too, like in Vietnam, like it's a corrugated metal. So I keep wanting to use materials that are economically and globally common in my work. And I guess sales count. So that it kind of came as like, oh yes, like I have another material to work with the corrugated material. And then I went to Home Depot, and brought in the tarp. So, was that your question? Yeah, the corrugated metal, like I got really excited about. So this is the first of a series. I think I have 6 others this is the first I completed. So, and the first of the series. So it's kind of exciting that, to share it in that sense. But here I have one photograph on the top and bottom that I divided in half. So that's the top half of that photograph.
Right,
yeah.
the sky. let's go a little deeper into the darkness of the new work, because no, I mean it really grabbed me, and so I want to sort of explore it further. You know, it's the tone of these, not just the affect, but even the color value. You know, it's dark, it's black, and the red you used is also sort of a lower value red. You know, we're in this sort of zone of it's penumbral, and to me, the way you've cut these also kind of, along with the colors that are remaining in them, evoke ruin, you know, and burned or bombed out buildings and this kind of thing. So, you know, and when you were speaking about this and your thoughts around it, it was some tough stuff that you were talking about. So I'm curious about, you know, to hear you talk a little bit more about the change in their visual aspect and the visual affect of them and its relationship to the content and sort of that whole new, because again, it's just so different. Or even if I think about the phone books, you know, she made this phone book piece, which was sort of all the chroma, you know, together, and they were beautiful, you know, so it was like this beautiful visual experience that would just like set you back for a minute because of the impact. It was so, like, such an intense kind of aesthetic pleasure that came with that work. And these are, you know, these are hitting very differently, so I'm interested to hear you sort of expand a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm in a different place. I now have 2 kids. When I made the rainbow piece, there were no kids. There's a lot of studio time. Yeah, but becoming a parent, there's just so many changes, and I think I wanted that to be reflected in the work. And I think I was trying for that with those, but I think I was, I think these pieces kind of reflect really like how ideas about parenting and motherhood can be like very, very rigid. And it's this prescription for how you're supposed to perform these responsibilities and even how you're supposed to like perform the emotional stuff too. It's very boxed in. And I think part of my process was like, I needed to heal from that and figure out like what kind of parent I was gonna be. And I think it's reflected in the work. Like, I think the colors on the back, it was like very pop, very primary, and even something a little maybe like exuberant about them. And I don't think that's what I wanted. I think I wanted these like the feelings of melancholy and abjection. So it's kind of like if you took the reds and the browns from those and mixed them, is what's happening here. And I liked the references to blood and earth, and that felt like all I needed really. And then the black was like, just always kind of thinking about like what's visible and what's hidden. And I'm mentioning black pieces, but they're not really here. There's a lot of these from this series are on black paper, and so they're like really, really dark. But playing kind of with the shadow side, like what's not as visible, like in both worlds that I'm talking about. And I think I'm going even darker now, like with what's in the studio. And I don't necessarily feel like I'm in a dark place, but I think I have to work through that on paper.
Well, I mean, as Beth, you were talking about this just a minute ago, you know, this sort of the environmental destruction, which is of course what your work has been talking about from the beginning, but you were like specifically calling out the way the environmental destruction is kind of embodied in this work. And you think about ruins, and then you think about the maternal, and you think about matricide, which is, you know, we're killing our mother, right? The planet that we're going to make ourselves extinct by the destruction we're doing to Mother Earth, which then becomes a form of suicide. So it all becomes like, you know, you are eliciting, and then it makes sense why it looks like ruins to you, because then you imagine this sort of post-apocalyptic, what will be left of our cities when we're gone kind of thing, as they are gradually fall apart. So on that bright note, let me open it. Also, I want to make sure I open it to all of you. Yeah, please go ahead.
I wanted to talk about the shapes that you cut out in this piece. I mean, they're almost figurative, and sometimes they almost look like you know, red boards, like this circuitry to me.
Yeah.
And that extension idea is interesting, you know, these vibrations of these circuits.
So all of the shapes are from the same source of the grocery ads, and what's happening here is the enlargement. I feel like when they're enlarged, you kind of notice like what's in between a lot more. Like the black becomes more present than it was when things are smaller, it just looks kind of like a puzzle, but here it's like the forms become more dominant. And what I felt about these forms all along, and I get a lot of this from feedback from people that look at my work, is like, most people have a connection to these forms and they don't really know why. And I think I felt the same thing, is that there's something very archetypal about not just the forms, but they're removed, like they're absent. And I think it has to do with like our desire for security and having our needs met is somehow represented in these shapes for me.
Well, that one was about caregiving too, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
I mean, it does, you see the arm, there's a certain power. I like it next to the powerful surging water too.
Yeah,
There's a great resonance there.
Another big influence, you talk about architecture, but I think subliminally I'm always really inspired by Japanese and Chinese landscape painting. And so somehow getting these shapes to reference that is really important to me, because I just find those images really beautiful, and I wanted to bring beauty into this in some way. They have to be something you want to look at. Yeah.
Kind of jumping off of what you just said, what you were saying earlier, I noticed that both of your work seems to be heavily about what is revealed and what is hidden. And so I have like a process question in terms of when you're doing your work, how much of that is deliberate decision from you, and how much of that is kind of dictated by your process? And that's a question I'd like to ask both of you.
You go first.
Well, I am very familiar with my photo transfer process, and there's a certain language, a certain texture I'm used to, I know will come, but it can vary, so there's a lot of letting go. And of course, my first time to transfer onto sale. So I'm always expecting a certain amount of a surprise. So I'm bolder and like experimenting with things and hoping they'll work with new materials in the sense of even adhering like the tarp to the corrugated aluminum. Like, so I mean, there's a lot of discovery for me in the process, and even mounting these, I knew I didn't want them to be flat. I wanted to push them into an object realm, but it's not usual, and it's unique in the show that I'm actually revealing my source photographs, because I usually like take a few steps through them, and so it's I guess it's a stepping stone for me in this show.
Is there something actually happening in the time between, like when you take the photo and when you actually use it?
Years.
Yeah. Like,
You
are
know,
you looking at
Photoshop, do you manipulate them in
I mean, there's just maybe slight lighting editing, but actually, for years I just had them printed. So there's a new relationship of scale and image on material. Yeah, it's time really has played a factor, even when I've transferred works onto tarp or canvas. Before I bring in the paint, I mean, they could sit there for 2 years. Like I think there's, I remember my mother was helping me with the transfer, and she's like, "Oh, I love these photographs. They're so beautiful." It was a series from Vietnam, and then she saw what happened during the transfer, and like gaps are torn into it, and she's like, "What is going on?" She's like, "These photos were so beautiful," and I'm like, you pay a certain amount for each transfer, and like, or I would print on 40 by 60 inches on plexiglass and smash them with hammers or axes, and that's $600 that's going into a series. And so I guess it's letting go moments, and when I start with the paint, it's another like I can screw this up, and I'm like, okay, this is what I do, like that letting go. So you get them all perfectly printed, and then you're doing new things. I've never mounted photographs like this before, and yeah, so I give in to the letting go a lot in the process. Yeah.
So I'm also kind of balancing spontaneity and planning and design, but how it works for me usually is there's a very long period of experimentation and getting to know the material and developing a vocabulary. And then once I have the vocabulary, I can kind of work more.
Okay.
Yeah, but
So does that mean there are many of these that maybe you don't exhibit or are just like steps in the process?
so many, yes.
Okay.
And steps in the process, yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got
But I like to work, I have a very large table and I like to have like my papers and my cutouts spread out and there's a lot of just shifting and moving. I call it like arranging. And I use my iPhone to like, I found this is really helpful because I can't really work on the wall because of that like moving around that happens. So I love taking pictures of a collage in progress and looking at it like more objectively as an image, seeing if it's working and then maybe readjusting. You know, things might be in that state for a couple weeks before I glue things down.
And I just have to comment, like, as you were speaking of runes and you process, like, you know, when you travel and you get those flip books, especially in Rome, you know, and you can see all the layers of history with the acetate. And I like, it's a new thought, but I like thinking about that relationship to the landscape and that you aren't offering us the full picture, like that ideal or what was to be some finished existence it's not available anymore, but it's still, because my brain went there, you know, and thinking of the layers, you know, I'm like, oh, there's this layer and this layer, and then I think about the bottom layer, you know, which I'm trying to isolate, but, you know, in a way it's, you know, it's more of an abyss, you know, and since I started thinking of it that way now, I'm kind of reading them through those layers of accessibility and what we build up to some idea of what was once great, you know, like that sort of idea, and yeah.
Let's talk about the sale for just a moment. We haven't talked about it directly yet, and you know, this piece is called Exodus, which is of course the second book in the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, and you know, it tells the story of the Jews escaping Egypt, escaping slavery. You know, you have some sort of backstory in your own family involving some sort of escape. I don't know if it was World War II, you know, the hidden Jew, or if it's as far back as the Spanish expulsion, or what the back, I don't know if you even know that, but there is some sort of backstory there that's resonant with the idea of Exodus. And I'm curious, you know, for you, when you go to Peru, you're all at once, like, you're a tourist and a foreigner, but you're also a native in a way. Like, you have this kind of blended thing, and so the sale seems to be alluding to all those things, and you've got this image that's transferred but completely trashed, you know. And so I wonder if you could sort of talk about how all of that is engaged in this piece, you know, and how.
Yeah, well, the sale came about when I was trying to make sense of understanding where my maternal grandfather or grandmother came in from. Well, my great grandmother on my mother's father's side. But anyway, that was the line of Judaism from that side, and that's the big unknown. But so when I was thinking of the series, I mean, it was probably a year and a half ago, I came dragging sales into Keystone. I was like, look at my sales. But I had some idea of that was the material. Tarp wasn't the material. And so, you know, there was some time turning my head around what is the material, researching sales. And so this kind of feeds into immigration, which is many different parts of my background. Like on my father's side, there was shift from the Ukraine into the, you know, Austrian-Hungarian area, then to through Ellis Island, you know, as Jews on both sides there. So, I mean, I don't go many generations back in America, you know, just my father was born in the United States and his father was born in the United States, but he's an orphan, and everyone else was born somewhere else. So, and then on my mother's side, it was around the 1860s. I was calculating that my that my great-grandmother came in through Moyendo from somewhere, so I was trying to study like the Moroccan or the Sephardic Jews that came in more from Morocco or the Balkans or North Africa, and some from Portugal and Spain, but trying to understand that route. And just this idea of flight to find a new home and safety, which, also, whether we're in our own cities and we are in a situation where we're homeless, or, you're truly a refugee escaping like, political situations, like we're all trying to travel, by foot or by ocean, to establish a new home. So I just, again, a lot of it's in the I don't know territory, but this idea of a journey and, Exodus, I felt like was a good title. I mean, that's applicable to so many. It's happening today, it's just like, it's happening on our streets, right? We're surrounded by this idea of trying to get from point A to point B for a better, and that's all human hope, that's kind of to survive. Like, it's all we can do is like move forward to survive. And I just feel like while my parents met in Arequipa, when my father had the privilege to be in the Peace Corps after his graduate school, education, he came to Arequipa. He thought he picked potatoes because he had his master's of architecture. He was given civic projects. So, and my mom was teaching at a preschool, so they, met in a privileged way, not in a like refugee Titan sort of way, but like both sides come from this flight, and so it's just somehow I thought we had generations in Peru, like somehow like my mother's side seemed more grounded, and it was only in 4th grade we found out my grandfather was a hidden Jew, and then and then all of a sudden he wasn't from Chile, he was from Moyendo, and like all these layers. So like my maternal side feels like unmapped out, and that's I guess I felt like I really had to get this work out, and so it's kind of a lot of things in motion, and I think there was a lot of groundedness in land, like dirt landscape versus water landscape and architecture, and I was kind of building different connections to this place, Peru, that I feel, close to and don't, but now there's also so much unknown. So it's kind of how that title and that piece came about. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please.
I was going to say, as you were talking, Beth, that's your sale.
Yeah.
It's almost like in both your work, it's so interesting how as artists, right, we go from certainty, because we start with something, to uncertainty that leads us back into probably not that much certainty. Right? That's the thing. And in Katie's work, I was thinking from the first question, I was also thinking, speaking about certainty, it reminds me of the neural pathways a little bit. It's like, how they're sort of being lit up by trying to move from here and there and creating those images, whether it's kind of inside our brain or what we perceive, right, outside. And it's just really great how you two were able to connect that way. And I just wonder, since we're talking about going from certainty to uncertainty and so forth, is what you envision as you move forward from like this work that you've brought together.
What do we envision? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for yourselves, like individually or even collectively for another show.
I want to do more of this work, and I'm kind of struggling with it because I'm like, then I have to tell people I've been working on this for like 6 or 7 years.
You don't have to.
But no, I'm still really interested, and I want to go bigger, I think. And I am going back to Kala where I printed these, so I'm going to be printing more and seeing where they go. But I'm also found my next material, which is barbed wire. So I'm hoping to work more sculpturally on the side, which is kind of how things start. Like I might spend a little bit of time every week on this new project and bending wire and seeing where that goes.
Well, and because I just launched the first of this one that has been about 2 years in the making, besides when I was there, I took the photo. And then again, like, these two are series I started at Keystone. Well, I started this when I had a studio at Bendix, but so it's, yeah, I'm moving to complete these, I don't know, 6 or 8 more of them and seeing how they evolve. So that's on the forefront.
I want to say I've spent an extended amount of time in Peru in my life.
Oh,
in
nice.
Abancay and Lima and Cusco. And,
Oh,
so it was really, I didn't know coming in that this was, the photographs were from Peru. So it was really cool to see it. But I was thinking a lot of the nature of like water and to me like water represents something that's like kind of like an indestructible force that's fluid and you can't really do much to it. But what I think is so fascinating is that the what you place the water onto is in a sense something that is either meant to guide water, protect from water, or hold it, ink, like hold it and show it in a really like perfect way. And I just think it's really interesting that you chose to not transfer the photography in a really like articulate manner on here for something that's like a sail, which is meant to like navigate and like move through water. And so I just think it was really interesting. So my question to you was like, as these different pieces evolve and your process evolves over time, is like, did you have that thought going in about some of the like how the water could work with the, obviously like you did, but like with the different textures, and like how much of it was intentional into some capacity, and then how do you see it like evolving per installation, I guess? I'm sort of new to asking some of these questions, but I'm just very interested.
no, well, I like how you articulated like how these materials are actually protecting or navigating us through in physical ways. I would say I have thought about tarp more clearly that way, as like I started using tarp for a number of reasons, but I also physically went backpacking when I was 20 and used tarp quite a lot as my shelter. So and when anyone goes camping, people use tarp, or you see it over construction materials use, like tarp was such a direct link of shelter. And I guess, not everyone picks up, almost everyone has bought tarp at some point, Many people have probably bought corrugated metal, but maybe not as much. So corrugated metal and sail, while they're more common materials of construction, it's less of a grab some tarp, and tarp is a little bit more accessible in that protection of anything sort of way. But I think you said it really beautifully. I like how you framed that. I wasn't thinking about that as directly. So thank you.
And it ties
Agreed.
back into your comment about certainty and uncertainty, like that the rigid materials provide this certainty, and the water is can be so unpredictable.
Right,
Yeah.
that's an analog.
I remember when, you just said that, and then he was talking about also the landscape is always uncertain too, right? We think we're certain it's a certain way. Well, that sounds terrible.
No, makes sense.
And then all of a sudden we realize, that things are changing so much that you both bring that up.
Yeah.
Well, that's the starkness of your landscapes, and maybe these offer, well, going into a darker assumed direction, like, and these are elements coming out from the top, which is so fun. Because I did not think about ambionic fluid like with these when we brought it up, and so now I have to go back to the womb, the greatest area of nurturing, and that becomes an area of potential of growth. So
Like blood in the body.
with something so unnurtured, from there maybe, while things are a seam of despair, like if we start, I started reading it that way when you brought that up, water breaking, which is like a whole new way to think about it, yeah. And then, just yeah, it's just powerful because that space, if one were to, introduce it or think about it that way, it is the greatest space of creation, and that can be read, politically in some ways too, like, with our leaders being male, and when our new direction's gonna come about. People speak about, if women are in leadership, maybe there's a different sensibility towards, decisions that are being made. Who knows, except the chance hasn't been given.
It'd be nice to find out in
Yeah,
this country.
yeah. So, yeah, it's the conversation. That's the fun part about these things, is just like what can come up and all the contributions that can be experienced from the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we have some time just to chat informally, and everyone can talk to Katie and Beth, informally. So I don't want to burn through all the way to 2 o'clock. So let's end it here so that we can also just hang out a little bit. So thank you.